Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Well, welcome everybody to today's episode of Et Al., a Baylor University Press podcast. I'm joined today with Todd Copeland, who graduated from Baylor University in 1990. He's the Director of Advancement Marketing in Baylor's Division of Marketing and Communications. He also earned a master's degree from the University of Georgia, a PhD from Texas A&M University, and he has served for more than 30 years in institutional advancement at Baylor, where he has also taught American literature and creative writing. And we're here today to discuss his book, The Immortal Ten, which serves as the definitive account of the 1927 tragedy and its legacy at Baylor University. Todd, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So tell us a little bit about the story of the Immortal Ten. You have this book, this history. Tell us about what the story is, the lore.
Sure. Well, specifically, the story is about a horrible accident that occurred in 1927, and the students, students and the coach who was involved in that. So it was on January 22nd, 1927, and the basketball team was scheduled to play Texas that night, Saturday, in Austin. So it was going to be the first road game for the team that year. And a classic Texas norther had blown through the night before, so it was in the 60s the day before, and then overnight it got to about freezing. So when they left what then was Carroll Field, where all the athletic complex was, it was drizzly, it was very cold, and the route to Austin was a lot different than it is today.
Right,
So as they were passing through Round Rock, they approached an open grade railroad crossing, and the view to the west was blocked by some sidecars. And so they, at the last second, they had about 4 seconds to react. They saw a train coming toward them from the west. The person who was the driver was actually a student. That was his job.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Sort of like a student-athlete job back then. He was a freshman. And he had never been down that road, so he wasn't familiar with it, but the coach was. And none of this was his fault, but so they saw the train coming at the last second, and he tried to make some evasive maneuvers across the tracks. He couldn't stop in time, and unfortunately the train hit the back of the bus, going about 60 miles an hour.
Wow.
And so some of the students on the bus were killed immediately, 4 others died later, but in total 10 students died. They weren't all basketball players. Some of them were, one was a cheerleader or yell leader as they called it back then.
Sure, yeah.
And then, the aftermath of the story, the aftermath of the accident is part of the story, as well as the legacy of remembering the 10 students who died. So that's the specific part of the story. But it also, I think, is a larger story that involves the importance of community and friendship and the families of the victims, and also the friendships between the victims and those who survived, and also beyond that, just a story about the human spirit, persevering through tragedy, and trying to find a path forward. So it's a story that's specifically about athletes. Some of the ones who died were the most prominent athletes on campus, and that's always a tragic loss that's reoccurred over times in history. And so this sense of people who were killed before their prime is part of the story. But it is also really at the heart about a special time, a special group of people, and how they managed to get through this horrible accident.
Yeah. It's interesting how you say, too, that it's not just the events of the day and maybe the seconds or minutes where this tragedy occurred, but also kind of the surrounding moments leading up to and then following the legacy that was left behind by these students. So what is the significance of this story of the Immortal Ten in the life of Baylor in a broad sense? What kind of is the story bringing to the table with regards to Baylor University, and why do we keep it alive after so many years?
Sure. Well, the significance is that, it was such a shock to the campus community when it happened. Baylor University was a lot smaller back then than it is today. It had about 1,300 students, so it'd be, like high school today. So losing 10 of the students, everyone would have known them.
Right.
Especially, as I mentioned earlier, several of them were some of the most popular and athletically talented people on campus.
Right.
2 of them, one who survived and one who didn't, their names were Abe Kelly and Weir Washam. They had been friends since childhood, and they had played football at Waco High back when that was a dynasty. They won multiple state championships under Paul Tyson, and they brought that to Baylor, and they helped Baylor to win some conference titles. So Abe Kelly was the halfback or running back on the football team the preceding fall to when this accident happened, and Weir Washington was the quarterback. And he survived. He was in the back of the bus where the train hit, but he jumped out of a window at the last second. And his friend Abe was next to him. And he saw Abe trying to get out of the same window when he got hit. So it's a really horrible moment to contemplate. So that was very shocking for the campus. And so, its significance is that it was an important event in Baylor University's history. We might get to the larger impact of the story later as far as Texas. But the significance in the life of Baylor is that it lived on. It was a story that lived on. They had 3 of the students who died were from Waco, and Baylor hosted their funeral in Waco Hall. And then in the years after that, on the anniversary of the accident, chapel was a daily thing back then. Today's students would be shocked if they had to go to chapel every day, but they did. And so on the anniversary of the accident, there was a memorial observance for several years. And then, over time, that naturally ended. But then in the early 30s, so relatively soon after the accident, because it was in 1927, men on campus called what they labeled a mass meeting because they thought that the school spirit was not what it needed to be at the football games. And so it was a late night mass meeting among the men only back then. Women can come now too. But But one of the people who was involved in that first mass meeting and ongoing ones was the coach who had been on the bus that day when the train hit it. And his name was Ralph Wolf. And he remained at Baylor for a long time, but he was called on to tell the story of these students who died, who most of them were student athletes, and not just basketball players. Back then, if you were good, you played everything: football, basketball, track, baseball. And so he told their story to inspire the men to get pumped up about it. And so this became an annual event, eventually became known as the Freshman Mass Meeting. And it eventually was scheduled for the Thursday of homecoming week. And that tradition continues today, almost 100 years later. Those who come to the mass meeting hear the story of the Immortal Ten as a way to develop school spirit and a connection, originally with the freshman class, but now just with all of Baylor students. So that's its ongoing significance. And then, there have been other developments in recent years with the memorial statue being put in place in the middle of campus. But still, the heart of the tradition is the telling of the Immortal Ten story. And so that's a significance that it has, this almost 100-year tradition.
That's amazing. It's beautiful, too, and so inspiring how they kind of collected together to retell the story in order to revive school spirit, and that the same story is used to this day to revive school spirit. And it kind of ties together those students that were in the 1920s, 1930s with today's students, and kind of creating a school spirit that's like outliving those students, and that will hopefully outlive today's students as well and continue the legacy. So.
Yeah, sure. And, on one level, I think when people first hear about this as a tradition and a story, they think, well, that's kind of morbid. These are 10 young men who died in a horrible accident. It was the worst bus train wreck in Texas history at the time. How does that develop school spirit? But the thing is like what you just said, these students who died were right at the beginning of their adult lives. And that's the same situation that all Baylor students are, or any college student is today. They're the person you could look next to in class, and that could have been one of these fellows who died. And it really could be today. And so that is one of the messages of the Immortal Ten story, is to treasure every day of life that God gives you, because it's going to end at some point, and it might be in a horrible, shocking way. That's just the truth of life. And so, to make the most of every day you have, to treasure your friends and family, these are the larger messages of the Immortal Ten story beyond, Baylor school spirit. It's a somber tradition, but it's one that really brings home the importance of being part of the Baylor family, treating each other compassionately, having this sense of community. That's really the heart of the story. It's not a gruesome accident.
That's really inspiring. And so you kind of worked to research and to compile this history into your book that came out in 2007, also with Baylor Press. And there's going to be a new edition, a second edition. So talk to us a little bit about what kind of inspired the revisiting of the story and what the new features are in the second edition.
Right. Well, one part of it is by and large, the story is a narrative of what happened and who the students were, and it's a very fact-based, reliable account of just what unfolded.
Right.
There are also two appendixes that treat the memorialization of the students into this mass meeting tradition, and then also one on the memorials that have been put in place. For the longest time, there wasn't anything except a plaque that was put in place in 1935 when a bridge was dedicated that goes over the railroad tracks where the accident occurred in Round Rock.
Okay.
So from 1935 onward, that was the only physical memorial to the Immortal Ten until Baylor, through the hard work of Chase Palmer, who had been a class president, raised money to build and to erect statues to memorialize the students, and that happened in 2007. So it was after the time of my book. So I catch up things on that because the mass meeting and the way the Immortal Ten story is told now has changed over the last 20 years.
Sure, yeah.
But with the heart of the story, with the narrative of the students who were, there were 22 students on that, but 22 men, 21 students and one former student, and then the coach. So 10 died, but 12 survived, which is in some ways it's equally interesting as the lives of the students who died. But the online research resources that are available now did not exist in the early 2000s. And so I was able to I have added a lot more to the book about the students' lives, who they were, who their families were, especially how they were raised, how many siblings they had, and also digging in a little bit more on some of the friendships between the students. I mentioned Abe Kelly and Weir Washam. Two other Waco students were Robert Hanna and William Winchester, and they were very good friends, and their families were very good friends. And there's correspondence between the two mothers after the accident, trying to console one another. And so really what I've done is to expand upon what already existed, to give a little bit more history about the families, also a little bit more about the train that was involved and who the engineer was. And then especially a lot about the lawsuits that came out of that event, and also how the man who was Baylor's president at the time, Samuel Palmer Brooks, how he handled that. I mean, it was a deep wound on campus, but also an event that exposed the university to a lot of lawsuits, a lot of litigation, and he had to manage all of that at the same time while his health was deteriorating. So it's really, I wanted to tell a fuller story. It's still a relatively short book that I think readers could read in one sitting. That was my original idea. Very readable, yes. So it's really just a deeper dive into into the lives of those who died, and also the 12 people who survived. I tell a little bit more about what they went on to do with their lives and how they related to this horrific accident as the years went by, and how the story got told in a way which was natural, in terms of eulogy, to make the students who died seem like heroes in some sort of way. Sure. Which they weren't, but that's the reaction, is to do that. And these fellow classmates or students who lived, they had survivor guilt. They didn't necessarily like the way that their students who died were being portrayed. So it was complicated for them, and no one really at the time would have thought about that. Nowadays, we do. We understand that as part of the story. So I tell a little bit more about those students who survived, some of whom went on to have very interesting careers.
It's so valuable that you're kind of coming back and providing this context and looking at new resources and fresh perspectives of this story that's been told for years and years and years, and kind of adding really personality to each of these 10, but also, like you said, the 12 that survived, their families. And I think that is kind of what the Baylor family is really about, is all those people that are surrounding. It's not just our student athletes, although that is a big part of life on campus, right? But really just creating context for those people and for them as people and as students, and not these kind of larger than life heroes that we sometimes make them out to be. So I think that has such a valuable impact, not only on the story as it lives in history, but also on students today even, and understanding, like you said before, the person next to you, that's a person too, and a student and a friend and a daughter or a son in their own right, and people that go on to live meaningful lives and have meaningful careers. So that's important work.
Yeah, and that was my main focus, was to tell the human story.
That's beautiful.
Especially, for something that's become a tradition, the individual people, the 10 people who died, and they're called the Immortal Ten,
Sure.
and that their memory will never be forgotten.
Right.
But the truth of who they were as young men gets lost.
Yeah.
And the truth of the young men who survived gets overlooked in a lot of ways. So
Right.
that's really what I wanted to tell, was the human story, not to. It's a complicated project to tell a story that involves just one moment in time, a train wreck. Well,
Yeah.
what do you make of that? So there's a lot of details about what happened and the aftermath of that accident, and how they went about tending to those who were wounded, how they collected the body parts of those who died, and how they were taken on a train
Yeah.
together in the baggage car
Yeah.
to the next stop to be treated. But really, even though that event defined and ended their lives, or defined it in some ways,
Yeah.
their lives were broader than that too. And so that's what I
Sure.
wanted to explore. And sort of along the same lines, this is a story that's very much at the heart of Baylor, but it's not just a Baylor story.
Yeah.
It's a Waco story. It's a Texas story.
Yeah.
The students who were on that bus, they were on that bus for a specific reason. Basketball and Baylor had brought them together,
Right,
but they
yeah.
came from all over the place. So this is a story that involved families from Abilene, Fort Worth, certainly Waco, Ennis, Gatesville, Uvalde. So, it was a Texas story. In the Sunday after the accident, or the Monday after the accident, the legislators lowered the state flag over the Capitol to have staff for a day.
Sure, yeah.
When the funeral was held for the Waco students, businesses closed for that hour. So,
Wow.
And telegrams of condolence came in from all across the country, from organizations and universities. So it was an event that shook a lot of the nation beyond just Texas. So it is a broader story, and it's one that it is about athletes. It's about athletics. So I think people who are interested in that would enjoy the book, but it's really more of a story about the people and who they were, who their families were. So
Right.
I think it has a much broader reach than being a sports book. It's really not a
Sure,
sports book.
yeah.
It's a book about friendship and community and overcoming tragedy.
It's a beautiful thing, too, how the community comes together, like you said, not just within Baylor, but across the United States, in Texas specifically. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about how the event affected Waco as a city, and what the lasting effects are for Waco as the home of Baylor University, and for these students in this tragic accident.
Yeah, there wasn't any sort of town-gown separation back then, and especially
Yeah.
Interstate 35 didn't come through the middle of
Right,
town,
yeah.
separating Baylor
Yeah.
from campus. So, Baylor was Waco's school. Granted, TCU had been here before, but they were
Sure.
gone by then.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier Abe Kelly and Weir Washam coming from Waco High. There were some other Waco High students, or football players in particular, that came that were really good. And so everyone who had followed them at Waco High, as they were winning state championships, would come and fill the stands at Carroll Field and watch them
Yeah.
play as well. There were many families here in town that had connections to the students who, were on that bus that day. So it definitely affected Waco in terms of being a loss that the whole community felt. Back then, these students also had to take other jobs to help pay for school, even
Yeah.
though it wasn't anywhere
Right.
near as expensive as it is today. But
Sure.
for instance, Abe Kelly worked as a fireman. And in fact, a number of football players did that. And so he spent a lot of time at the fire station that was just off of campus. And he would spend overnight sessions there. And so
Wow.
all the firefighters in town, they draped all of the fire stations in black after
Wow.
that accident because of his death. So it was something that really tested Waco's community and sense of how could something this horrible happen?
Yeah.
And people trying to understand that and coming together in mourning and support. Some of the families were fairly prominent in Waco who lost students, or
Sure.
with the Washams, he survived. His parents were very prominent politically in town. So it was something that had quite an impact.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, about 35 kind of splitting Waco, the city. And we also kind of talk about Baylor in the terms of like the Baylor bubble. But it is interesting how it seems like in 1927, in the early 30s, Baylor was, like you said, Waco's school. And so it's interesting too how that might be inspiring or encouraging for today's students to really get out in Waco and to be a part of the larger community. And for Baylor, as you know, we talked about the Baylor mission, to be a part of the community as well and to really kind of take that as their own. Because the same way that Waco rallied around these students, that connection still lives.
It is. And one sidebar on the story is the existence of Waco Hall, which all Baylor students know, and you go to chapel there. Well, why is it called Waco Hall?
Sure.
Well, it's called Waco Hall as a direct result of this accident. So after the accident, there were all kinds of suggestions on ways to memorialize the students. One of them being to build the chapel building had burned a few years earlier. And so at that time, there was a temporary chapel building.
Okay.
So Baylor needed a new building in which to have chapel and other events. And so there was a suggestion to build a new chapel with columns, a real grand structure. And President Samuel Palmer Brooks was all for that, but he said at the same time, how do we pay for that?
Yeah.
And then if you think of the timing of this accident happened in January 1927. Well, a couple of years later, the stock market crashed and the Depression began. So fundraising hadn't really taken off in the first few years. And then after that happened, it wasn't going to happen. But what did happen was that the city of Dallas tried to lure Baylor away from Waco. They made a big offer of money and land, and suddenly people in Waco were confronted with the possibility of the university leaving, and that would have been a huge blow to the city.
Right.
So the citizens of Waco rallied to do something that would convince Baylor, show Baylor that they wanted them to stay here, and that was they raised the money to build Waco Hall, which is why it's called Waco Hall.
Yeah.
The Waco Hall got built because the memorial to the Baylor students who died, the Immortal Ten, couldn't happen. So it was a project that sort of evolved from that into Waco. Then once Waco Hall was built, that was sort of the end of any ideas of building something in recognition of the students who died, the Immortal Ten. So that's why there wasn't anything on campus memorializing them. But it does bring home the connection between Waco and Baylor, that there's no separation between the two. Both were involved very intimately with each other. And that was the case then. I mentioned, this university was quite a bit smaller. Waco High actually was about the same size at the time as Baylor was. So it was definitely, Waco's college, and a lot of pride went into that. It really is a Waco story, not just a Baylor story.
Sure. That's so interesting. I didn't know that about Waco Hall. So that's really cool that the community kind of came together and got Baylor to stay. Clearly, we're still here, right? So, yeah, that's awesome. Well, you kind of touched on this, so maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. The memorial that exists now on Baylor's campus that is a statue immortalizing the Immortal Ten. And so what kind of goes through your mind when you walk by the statue to the Immortal Ten? And what do you hope that other alumni and students are thinking about when they pass by that statue?
Well, when I walk by it, just because I've been writing and researching these 22 men and their families, I just think of them as humans, as people that I would know. I think of them as part of my family.
Right.
I mean, I know so much about all of them, way more than I put in the book.
Sure,
It's like an iceberg. What's in the book is just the very tip of it that's above water, and I know so much more about their families that's underwater and not in the book. So that's what I think of as the human story. I think having the statues there does humanize them as figures. They are all 10 of them are represented. So it's not just a story they hear in the abstract. They can actually look and see, here's Merle Dudley. He's the Yale leader. He has
like a megaphone
in his hand, or here is the guy who was a reporter for the Lariat. He's got his notebook in hand. So I think it does bring home the human story about it. And that's what I hope readers of the book will take away, and I think that's what people who visit the memorial will take away, and especially for today's students, if they hear the story in the Immortal Ten, it's a very condensed version of it.
Right.
If they read my book, they will have a more expanded picture about who these students were, and that could be something they could think about when they look at the memorial, and think about how it applies to their lives. Some of those themes that I mentioned earlier about, these were people who are at the same stage of life as I am right now. How does the prospect of my potentially dying tomorrow impact the way I live today?
Right.
And they didn't have the chance to contemplate that, but I do. So what can I make? How can I make a difference with my life?
Yeah, That's so meaningful. I also love whenever I walk by, I took a class in Old Main over the summer, and when I would walk by, it's so interesting how the figures kind of come out of the wall at you. And I think that's similar to what you're doing in your book too, is pulling these figures out of a really static position and into a real living and breathing example of, like you said, what it means to be human and what it means to have that, Baylor spirit, but really the human spirit, and to really come around one another, live life to the fullest, and just acknowledging, like you said, that life is short and that we have to take each day for what it's worth. So, yeah, that's so beautiful. I love it. Well, it's been 20 years since the book's first release, almost, right? Just about. And what do you hope is the legacy of this event for the next 20 years going forward as we look to the future?
That's a good question. I hope that this expanded, revised, updated, however you want to describe it, sparks a renewed interest in the story of the Immortal Ten beyond it just being a tradition at Baylor. I think that's going to happen of its own self. It has this momentum. It's not going to end.
Right.
Once you have a tradition, it's hard to end it, and it shouldn't be ended. It's a good tradition.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I just want to give readers the opportunity to learn more about who these students were and how they dealt with what happened, or how their families dealt with the loss of young men, and to keep that going forward into the future. There will be the 100th anniversary in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And so I'm certain Baylor is going to mark that anniversary in a number of ways on campus and maybe even off campus. One interesting element of the accident and the aftermath of it is that President Brooks assigned a student and a faculty to attend the funeral for each of the 10 students where they lived. And Baylor, in fact, helped pay for the funeral costs for a number of those students. And so some of the grave markers are actually identical. They were done in a way to match each other. So I could see maybe Baylor revisiting that and doing something around the grave sites, which, again, that does sound morbid. Some of the elements of the story is morbid, but honoring those who are dead, especially as a Christian university, and knowing that they are part of the body of Christ, deceased and living together, I think it would make sense to do something there. I mentioned they are spread around quite a bit. There are 3 of them are buried just down the street from here, where we are here in Oakwood Cemetery.
Sure.
But the others, are buried in their hometowns around the state.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your faithful research and your work on immortalizing the Immortal Ten, and being willing to revisit this project years later and continue to update the story and keep it alive for Baylor students and alumni and for the community, for the Waco community. So we appreciate your work. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
Glad to be here.
And for anyone who's listening or watching online, we hope that you will purchase your copy of The Immortal Ten at BaylorUniversityPress.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.